All right. Welcome to Haftarah study, everyone. Stephanie, I know, likes to prepare ahead of time, and I've already
You've changed
telegraphed,
everything. It's a different
telegraphed that I'm throwing her for a loop. So,
That's all right. The key to I actually found something that was most pertinent to what I was writing.
oh,
So
good.
you'll see it when you read my story.
Good. All right. Awesome. Well, so we're going out of order today, and I'll tell you about why. But Richard, welcome back too. You guys are
Thank
you
you.
guys are. Did you finish your summer course?
Pretty much, yeah.
Pretty much. Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Good. Welcome back. I'm glad you could
Thanks.
join us.
Yeah.
Good. So just to get you caught up on sort of what the shtick is in here, we're learning the Haftarah portions for the year. The Haftarah comes from what I like to call the rest of Nach, all the parts. It's readings from the prophetic books that are usually thematically connected to the Torah portion of the week. And they go a little bit unappreciated, I find, frequently, because they're usually not. They're read in Hebrew only. If they are translated, they're really underexplained. I frequently don't talk about them as part of my drash. So I decided it'd be great to go into a little bit more detail this year. There are lots of different theories about how these got picked, but really what matters for us is that somebody selected these verses from the prophetic books to read in connection with the Torah portion. And that's a really interesting light in which to look at them. I found some really useful questions to ask, or how did this text speak to people at the various times through which it's been read, both at, from the outset at the time when it was written, how is this an important story? How did this speak to them? How is this spoken to Jewish communities who chose to read this portion in between then and now? And how does it speak to us today? So we'll do a little bit of a Torah portion summary, then I'll give a little bit of background on the book that the Haftarah comes from, and then we'll dive in and read and kind of see what comes up. Now, you can see at the top of the screen, and I have a cool new display here. This is the Haftarah for Parashat Pinchat. Now, Parashat Pinchat is from the book of Numbers. We read Pinchas back in like May or something. But as I was thinking about which Haftarah to do this week, we are still in that period in between Tisha B'Av and Rosh Hashanah, where all of the Haftarot, all 7 weeks, are what they call Haftarot of consolation, and they all come from the same book, the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is great. We did Isaiah last week. In fact, we did Isaiah the last 2 weeks. And all of these Haftarot of consolation have basically the same theme, basically the same message. And because I'm trying to keep it, interesting, and because I'm trying to balance the genres that we're reading, I think it's good to balance in between prophetic, prophecy and narrative, mostly just because it keeps it interesting and stimulating. I decided we're going to go out of order today. We're going to jump back to an interesting Haftarah that we never had a chance to study, just because of the way the timing worked out from previously in our cycle. So let me tell you a little bit about Parashat Pinchas, which you may recall. It's Numbers chapters about 25 to 29. It includes the very first verse of chapter 30. And what happens there in the story is we're in the 40th year after the Exodus from Egypt. People are now camped on the east side of the Jordan River, and we're in final preparations for entering the Promised Land. At the end of the parsha that precedes Pinchas, we were told that the Israelite men had become involved with women from the nation of Moab and had gone off and followed them into immoral and idolatrous practice. There's a dramatic punishment that ensues. Evidently, a plague strikes the Israelite people as a result. God tells Moses to execute the ringleaders of that movement to go consort with the Moabite women. And so God tells Moses to do that. Moses tells the officials that that's what they need to do. And at just that moment, one of the notable men of the community brings a Midianite woman over. The Torah seems confused about whether they're Moabites or Midianites. This is not the only place where this kind of conflation occurs, but it's clear we're talking about the same group of women. Brings one of these women over in front of everyone, and Pinchas, who is the grandson of Aaron and the son of Eleazar, who is the high priest, has this moment where he just kind of snaps, takes a spear, and kills both the man and this woman. Evidently, this is a positive thing because it stops the plague. And that's the end of the portion that precedes Pinchas. In Parashat Pinchat, we learn that Pinchas is rewarded for killing the Israelite and the Midianite woman. His descendants will be a hereditary priesthood in Israel. The portion continues with Israel fighting a war against the Midianites. There's another census taken. The whole incident with the daughters of Zelophehad takes place, where there's the process of evolution of property inheritance law in practice. The daughters of Zelophehad basically petition to inherit their father's estate in the absence of any male heir. Joshua is chosen as Moses' successor. And we also learn about the sacrificial ritual for sort of all festival occasions. It's a bit all over the place in terms of what happens in Parashat Pinchas. But I think you'll see right away the connection to between the Haftarah we're going to read and Pinchas. So the Haftarah we're going to read, this actually, what you see on your screen already, takes place. This is part of the background. The Haftarah for Pinchas is from the first book of Kings and begins at chapter 18, verse 46. So you can follow on the screen with me, but if you're going to read, you have a book in front of you, you're going to want to open up to 1846 in the book of Kings, or if you got a Chumash, just turn to Parashat Pinchas and it'll be at the back of that. Okay. Let me give you a little bit of background on the book of Kings. We actually touched on the book of Kings quite a while back when we sort of started this series. I think we read a piece from the second Kings. But just to refresh your memory on what the book of Kings is, it's divided into two these days. There's First Kings and Second Kings. It was originally one book. That division into one, first and second, came later after canonization. And the book relates the history of Israel from the declining days of King David, so about the 10th century BCE, through the beginning of the Babylonian exile, about the 6th century BCE. So about 4 centuries of history that covers beginning with the united monarchy under David, covers the transfer of power to David's son Solomon, and then after Solomon, the split into northern and southern kingdoms. The northern kingdom, also called Israel, southern kingdom, also called Judah. I'm probably going to variously refer to them that way: Israel and Judah, northern and southern kingdom. And Kings presents this history that's what they call synchronistic. It's sort of two histories at that point. It tells both the story of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom in this kind of overlapping, weaving together way. That lasts almost 2 centuries until the northern kingdom is destroyed by Assyria in 722. And the remainder of the book covers all the way down just the history of just the southern kingdom down to 586 and the Babylonian exile. Oops, my light just turned itself off. I think it ran out of batteries. You can still see me. The green screen's still working. That's good. Okay. Okay. It is not a history in the contemporary sense of the word. Like, it's not a factual description of past events really at all. It's really more like an extended theological essay. It was written by a person, or perhaps multiple persons, with passionately held beliefs, who were convinced that the destruction of the northern kingdom and the eventual fall of the southern kingdom were due to the misguided policies of their kings. So the focus is very much on the kingship and the monarchy and the behavior, good or bad, of all those kings of Israel and Judah. Events are described selectively. The author doesn't really make an attempt to cover, history in a comprehensive way. It's really deliberately focused on the events that matter to this theological position. And the author will, not just retell them, but comment or summarize them as illustrations of the lesson that he thought that they taught. The final document, the final book of Kings, which likely has more than one author, would have been relevant to the post-destruction communities in both Judah and Babylonia, basically because it explained their situation. Why did this book, why was it preserved? It's because it had a theory about why did these bad things happen to us, basically. It explained their situation as not only the outcome not only of religious, policies of their kings, but also the behavior of their own ancestors. We hear stories about both what the kings did and also what the people did. They many of them violated the ancient revealed teachings and paid the price, basically. Okay. Questions about the Book of Kings and along those lines before we jump into specifically what happens in our, actually a little bit of background to our Haftarah selection, but any questions about the Book of Kings, generally the overall context? We're good? Okay. So we're going to start out actually a little bit before. Like I said, our Haftarah begins in chapter 18. We're going to start out in chapter 16 of the Book of Kings by introducing a key figure who is Achav. I just saw somebody reference Moby Dick the other day, and so if you pronounce this guy Ahab, I suppose that's okay too. But in Hebrew, he's Achav. We're going to introduce him as the king of Israel, and you'll get right away get an idea of the author's perspective on King Achav. Richard, you're at the top of my screen. Are you able to read aloud for everybody?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Achav, son of Omri, became king over Israel in the 38th year of King Asa of Judah. And Achav, son of Omri, reigned over Israel in Samaria for 22 years. Achav, son of Omri, did what was displeasing to the Lord, more than all who preceded him. Not content to follow the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, he took as wife Jezebel, daughter of King Ethbaal of the Phoenicians, and he went and served Baal and worshipped him. He erected an altar to Baal in the temple of Baal, which he built in Samaria. Achav also made a sacred post. Achav did more to vex the Lord, the God of Israel, than all the kings of Israel who preceded him.
Okay, you get the idea, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Pretty dim view of Achav and his reign. From the author's perspective, this is a king who really screwed up big time, right? He married into the Phoenician royal family, not only practiced Avodah Zarah himself, but brought it home. He brought it to Samaria, which is the capital city for the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, and in that way did one of the things that's considered the worst kind of Avodah Zarah, which is not only to do it yourself, but to lead others to do it. Achav, not a hero. He's one of the main reasons that Israel is punished, according to the framing of the Book of Kings. And it's at this point, interacting with Achav, that we introduce the character of Elijah the prophet. So this is a little bit of a long one. Is that large enough to be readable on your screens?
I'm okay.
Mostly? Okay. Stephanie, are you able to read it? You're next on my screen. Can you read it aloud? Oh, let me tell you before you jump in here. Elijah. Stories about Elijah occupy a pretty significant place in the author's composition about the Northern Kingdom. Evidently, the author had access to kind of a collection of Elijah stories that the author took and incorporated into the story of the kings of Israel at the point where it sort of made sense to do that. So there were stories about Elijah interacting with Achav, and so the author sort of stitched them together here. We're kind of taking a break from that, just the stories about the kings to tell about, sort of an extended narrative portion about Elijah. And probably did that because Elijah taught what the author believed. We'll see. You'll tell me what you think about Elijah as a hero or not. But evidently, the author of Kings thought he was. Elijah is a religious zealot, as we'll see, and a radical monotheist. His name literally means Eli Yahu, like my God is Yahu, which is just another name for the God of Israel. Like simple as that, right? My God is Yah. That's it. And as we'll read, he fought fearlessly and at great personal risk. This is the story that precedes our story. So there are four sort of main Elijah stories. This is number one. Our Haftarah is going to be number two. And so we're just going to get a snippet. I've edited a little bit so you get the key points. But our story draws, it happens in the context of story number one. So that's why it's important for us to read. Okay. Stephanie, you ready? You got to take yourself off mute.
Good idea.
Okay, go ahead.
When Ahab caught sight of Elijah, Ahab said to him, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" He retorted, "It is not I who have brought trouble on Israel, but you and your father's house by forsaking the commandments of the Lord and going after the Baalim."
Baalim, yeah.
Baalim?
Baal and those other Phoenician gods.
Baalim.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now summon all Israel to join me at Mount Carmel, together with the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah,
Mm-hmm.
Asherah,
Asherah.
who eat at Jezebel's table. Ahab sent orders to all the Israelites and gathered the prophets at Mount Carmel. Elijah approached all the people and said, "How long will you keep hopping between two options? If the Lord is God, follow the Lord, and if Baal, follow Baal." But the people answered him not a word. Then Elijah said to the people, "I am the only prophet of the Lord left, while the prophets of Baal are 450 men. Let 2 young bulls be given to us. Let them choose one bull, cut it up, and lay it on the wood, but let them not apply fire. I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood, and will not apply fire. You will then invoke your God by name, and I will invoke the Lord by name, and let us agree, the God who responds with fire, that one is God." And all the people answered, "Very good."
Okay. So this story opens with Elijah. He's been in hiding, basically, while Jezebel has been off having all the other prophets of Israel killed. So when he says he's the only one left, I think he believes that to be true. We also read about another prophet, Obadiah, who seems to be active as well. So from the text perspective, that's not totally clear, but from Elijah's perspective, he's the only one left. And Elijah just basically marches right up to Ahab and challenges him to a duel, right? He's like, "Okay, we're gonna put our gods to the test, and whichever one is the real deal, whichever one can ignite their own sacrifice with fire, that one's the real God, the one that really has power." And of course, the people agree. And of course, you can guess how this story goes. We're not going to read the whole thing, but of course, the prophets of Baal are unsuccessful. And when it's Elijah's, despite dancing and gashing themselves all day, when it's Elijah's turn, he has the altar doused with water twice, just for good measure, just to make just to really prove it. And then, Rachel, your turn. You want to read?
Sure. When it was time to present the meal offering, the prophet Elijah came forward and said, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your bidding. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, for you have turned their hearts backward." Then fire from the Lord descended and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, and the earth, and it licked up the water that was in the trench. When they saw this, all the people flung themselves on their faces and cried out, "The Lord alone is God, the Lord alone is God."
Woohoo!
And
Elijah wins, right? But then what happens?
Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal, let not a single one of them get away." They seized them, and Elijah took them down to the Wadi Kishon and slaughtered them there.
Okay. So, big victory for Elijah and the God of Israel, right? Elijah wins the duel, but then basically turns around and does exactly what was done to the prophets of Israel, or the prophets of God, which is to turn around and slaughter the Baalite prophets, right?
Yep.
What's your what's your and in in the aftermath of this, Achav basically, there's this whole other subplot with rain coming and things like that. But in the aftermath, Achav gets in his chariot and drives off towards Jezreel. I'll show you a map actually here, so you can get a sense of where this happens. Ooh, that did not come out as high resolution as I hoped. Okay. You may know Mount Carmel. It's sort of up here. This little jut of land is where the current city of Haifa is. There's a mountain right there. The Wadi Kishron runs along this river here, and the city of Jezreel is there, kind of at the end of that long wadi. So Achav gets in his chariot and drives away. What's your impression of Elijah so far?
Well, my impression of the whole thing is shaped by something I read recently, which had to do with viewing these old parts of our scripture through 21st century eyes. And so, yeah, this is not something that we would want to be done in our name today. But
at the time, in context,
in context of how people acted in those times and thought in those times, and the point of view of the person writing it, Elijah has just demonstrated in a very unarguable way that you don't want to follow the gods of Baal, and the priests of Baal. You want to follow me and the God of Israel, And if you think otherwise, you might want to reflect on what happened to the prophets of Baal. I mean, that is how in those days you made your point. It wasn't like you got to vote on it or something.
Yeah, fair enough.
So, this is a morality tale showing us that we're not to go after other gods. We're supposed to go after the one God, the God of Israel, the God who took us out of Egypt and did all these wonders for us.
Sure.
I think of Elijah. Well, he wasn't stupid.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
And he was a man of his times.
Yeah. Okay.
And he had a lot of courage to go up against Achav.
Good. Okay. Yes, I think you're right on both counts, that we read this both in its context, and we also read it as 21st century Jews, right? We can hold both of those at the same time, that this is both in some way grotesque and in some way, exactly what we should expect from texts of this era, right? But what you said at the end is exactly sort of where I think is useful for us to go, which is, what sort of a person, what sort of character traits does Elijah display? Courage, definitely. It's him on his own, sort of in the lion's den, right, surrounded by all 450 prophets. There's a lot at stake if he were to lose, right?
He had a lot of faith in the God of Israel.
Absolutely, yeah, faith. I think the connection to Pinchas is pretty obvious in terms of being a zealot and willing to kill for God, basically. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, Richard, you took yourself.
Yeah. So one of the things I noticed is that Elijah accuses the people. Well, let me back up just a second. Elijah's very, very much a showman, also.
Okay.
The fact that he douses the altar with water to make it for the thing to burst into flame, and then when the flames do come down, or when the fire comes down or ignites or whatever happened at that instance, it not only burns the sacrifice and all the wood, it burns the soil and the stone. I mean, it all burns up. Which, of course, also, it's kind of like God matching Elijah for showmanship, right? To emphasize that, God is the real God here.
Right.
But the interesting thing, I think, is that when God calls all the Israelites to Mount Carmel to witness this thing, he says, how long are you going to hop back and forth? I can't remember the exact wording.
Yeah.
So
hop between two opinions.
hop between two opinions.
Yeah, that's a translation. It's an idiom. It's clearly an idiom in the Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, the literal translation is, how long will you hop between two boughs, like between two branches?
Uh-huh.
I think is the idea. It's, sort of idiomatically saying you're flip-flopping, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. And so it sounds like I'm trying to figure out what the situation was there in Israel that's causing Elijah to do this thing, because he just shows up, at least in where we're reading from.
Right.
He shows up, where, as you said, he comes out of hiding, right?
Right, because Jezebel's been off slaughtering prophets.
Right. And Ahab is saying, is accusing him of being a troubler. He accuses Ahab of being a troubler. But then what does he do? He calls the people together, right? So he's not doing something directly against the king or against Jezebel.
Right.
He's calling the people together, and he's accusing them of not just following Baal, but they're evidently, it sounds like, when you keep hopping between two opinions or two bows, however you want to do it, it's like they're trying to cover all their bets, right?
Sure.
They're trying to serve God, and they're also serving Baal. And I'm sure somebody would, one of the Israelites maybe would say, well, we don't know what's going to work for us best, so we're just going to do whatever we need to for all these gods. And that's probably the essence of where Ahab has led the people astray, caused them confusion, so that they're trying to do both things at once.
Good. Yeah.
And then when the fire comes down and stuff, it's obvious that it's obvious to them that Hashem is really God, right? And Elijah then instructs them to go seize the prophets.
Right.
Now he's gotten the people behind him, right? To carry out this awful slaughter. But so he's been successful in swaying the people to understand, what's true and what isn't in the world.
Good. Okay. Two things I want to lift up from what you said, Richard. That was great. One is it seems like he won, right? It seems like he's successful. Keep that in mind. Two, in terms of how everyone involved in this whole duel thing, from Elijah to the prophets of Baal to Achav to the people, seems to have a particular idea about how God works, right? That what really proves God's power and God's reality is the ability to basically blow up an altar and as Richard said, really overdo it, not just ignite the sacrifice, but make a big show of it, right? You got to imagine, I think this would be a great adaptation for the stage, like an explosion of fire, right? Okay. In that context, I think we're just about ready to get to our Haftarah. The conclusion of this story is that Achav jumps in his chariot and rides down the Wadi Kishon towards Jezreel. Here's the last few verses. The hand of the Lord had come upon Elijah. He tied up his skirts and ran in front of Achav all the way to Jezreel. When Achav told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had put all the prophets to the sword, Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "Thus and more made the gods do," well, it just says, "What may the gods do," but it implies "do to me, if by this time tomorrow I have not made you like one of them." So what do you make of Elijah running in front of Achav? What do you think that means? What might that convey? You want to take a guess?
There's one of two possibilities
Okay.
that come to my mind.
Okay.
One is that Elijah's trying to get to Jezebel first.
Okay.
But the other thing has something to do with Elijah like being a herald,
Yeah.
Ahab, saying that
Right.
Ahab's coming.
Right.
Ahab is coming.
Good. Okay. Good guesses. Yes, it's possible. I think there's definitely a read here of it's a race and he's trying to get to Jezebel first somehow. For what purpose? It's unclear.
Yeah, but he doesn't get to her first, evidently, because
right.
next sentence we say Achav told Jezebel.
Exactly. And Elijah's on foot. Elijah's on foot and Achav's in a chariot.
Is it to show he's got some kind of superpowers that on foot he can be ahead of a chariot?
So actually I think we're on the right track a little bit. My gut on how to read this says we read it like the second thing that Richard says, which is that Elijah was sort of acting like Achav's footman for a little while, running alongside the coach, as it were, which at that time, as it was, we see this in other stories as well, would have been a way of both an honor for Elijah to be the footman and an honor for the king. So his motivation may have been to actually show respect for Achav, who despite his error is actually still both the king and still an Israelite. Maybe he thought he had won him over, right? He'd won him over to the story that had, the duel was presented as a success. So maybe he's under the impression that Achav, like all the people, has changed his mind. I looked up how far it is from Mount Carmel to Jezreel. Anyone want to take a guess?
100 miles?
No, it's not that much.
No,
Yeah.
20 miles.
Google says it's about 21 miles in a straight line. So most of a marathon, right? And so I think that probably explains, which is, a runnable amount of distance for someone in very good shape. But I think that's the explanation of the hand of the Lord came upon Elijah. Something like, that it gave him strength and stamina to run as fast as a chariot for 20 plus miles. How does Jezebel react to the news that all her prophets have been slaughtered? She doesn't take it very well at all, right? She's not converted by this display. And admittedly, she wasn't there, evidently. She didn't get to see the fire in person. But she basically says, I'm gonna kill you, Elijah, right? And takes an oath. Okay.
Well, she's been humiliated. I mean, really. I mean, this is a direct challenge to her power and authority.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Right.
In the ancient world, if you don't react strongly to someone who challenges you, you're not going to last long. So, not that she was a pleasant person, but I don't.
Right.
Unless God touched her heart and really changed her, I don't see any other ruler reacting too differently. Yeah,
that's fair. It's fair. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's the gods of her home country, too, right? Whereas Achav and the people who have adopted them, this is Jezebel's national god. Okay.
Oh, can I say one more thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that Achav goes to Jezebel. I mean, he's the king.
Right.
I would have thought if there was information that he wanted to share with her, he would have commanded her to come.
Sure, or sent a messenger or whatever.
Kind of implies some kind of imbalance in the power between them, that maybe Jezebel in some way has sway over Achav.
That makes sense, Richard, especially considering that he's adopted all of her gods and her priests.
Right. And now you get a sense of what the term when we call someone a Jezebel in English today, what that implies.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so these verses, verse 46 here is actually the beginning of our parsha, or our Haftarah portion. I think if we had just started here, this would have made no sense. That's why we had to go back and tell the story, right? Well, what is Elijah? Was he running from Achav for? What does that mean, right? Okay. Jezebel reacts negatively. Good. Okay. Let's continue with the parsha, or with the Haftarah portion. We're back to, let's see, I read a little bit, so we're back to Richard. Let's see how the story continues. We're basically done with Achav and Jezebel for this, but it's important that everything that happens now is, these are consecutive verses. It all happens in that context. Okay, go ahead, Richard.
Frightened, he fled at once for his life. He came to Beersheba, which is in Judah, and left his servant there. He himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush and sat down under it and prayed that he might die. Enough, he cried. Now, O Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my father's. He lay down and fell asleep under a broom bush. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Arise and eat." He looked about, and there beside his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, or the journey will be too much for you." He arose and ate and drank. And with the strength from that meal, he walked 40 days and 40 nights as far as the mountain of God at Horeb. There he went into a cave, and there he spent the night.
Okay, and I broke this verse in half because what comes next is sort of a new topic. That's why the dot there at the end. Okay, thank you. So Elijah's on the run from Jezebel, who is seeking to kill him. Which direction does he flee?
South.
South. Good. Into Judah. Why do you think so? Of all the directions to go.
It's safe territory, perhaps.
Potentially, yeah.
It's a different country.
Yeah.
He's amongst Israelites who maybe are more in line with theology.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. This is not like, I could have seen it going a lot of different ways. I think there's some of this that's like, well, it's sort of necessary for the story. If we was to flee north to Lebanon, we'd have to introduce new characters and all that kind of stuff, right? Yeah, and it kind of makes sense that he would go south. He may be looking for safety. Generally speaking, the Book of Kings has a positive view of King Asa of Judah, although evidently he doesn't feel safe enough to stick around. He just drops off his servant at Beersheba, who, by the way, was the servant running that whole way too? This seems like a kind of a plot hole that the editor missed, right? Yes. Where did the serpent come from? Don't worry about that. This text, like I said, has a pretty complex literary history. I think there's been some cutting and pasting from other, pre-existing sources to make this. So yeah, it's unclear where the servant came from or why that was something that Elijah felt he needed to do. But he really is on his own now, right? Okay.
Also, just as a sidebar, this story reminds me a lot of Jonah's story, because Jonah also sits under a bush and prays to die, says, "God, I just want to die."
So I was about to say, when you pipe up there, Rachel, from now on, what we're going to do through this coming story is we're going to keep a running list of every connection or allusion that we see to another biblical story. Because I think we're going to build up a sort of web of connection here that'll really help us figure out what the story means, or at least I hope it will. So you named one already, which is the sitting under the bush, right, and wishing for death reminds you of Jonah. Good. So we'll read that again on the high holidays. Rachel, you were able to sort of tell from memory Jonah's deal and why he sits under the tree?
Well, God has directed him to go to Nineveh and prophesy and tell them, they're going to be destroyed.
Mhm.
And then they repent and aren't destroyed. And he hadn't wanted to do this in the first place. I mean,
Right.
he'd gotten on a boat and tried to
Right.
get away from this duty that God tried to lay on him.
Mhm.
And so now he's a little upset because it's like, well, I didn't want to do this, but I did it. And now you didn't even destroy them. My prophecy, what was it for? If you
Right.
were going to, just let them repent and spare their lives, what was the point? God, you wasted my time.
Right.
You want to do this?
Right. So he
Just
sits
take
down.
me now.
Mhm.
He's guilting, he's guilting God. Just take me now,
Yeah, right. And I think the parallel here is clear, right? Despite seeming success, like in theory, the point of a prophet is to convince people to repent.
Right.
And Jonah succeeds, right? And Elijah succeeds in theory. At least it sounds like the people are back on the right path. But at the same time, there's this sense of isolation, failure despite the success somehow. It's like he's saying, I don't deserve any special treatment. I'm not, I'm of no use to you anymore, right? Something along those lines.
Is there a part of maybe all of us, not just the prophets, that, sorry about the phone ringing, that almost feels like maybe there's a part of us that wants to have something to cry out against,
Sure.
And when people change, we lose our jobs. We lose our reason for being, which was to, go and preach and, tell people you got to repent and the end is coming. And, it gives us a sense of maybe Jonah and Elijah, through their success, it's now like, well, what next?
It's like, how can I possibly do anything else after this, right? Yeah, like I've, achieved my purpose, but also like.
But now my purpose is done.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I think that's very possible, especially in light of what comes next. Yeah. How about this? So we have a divine messenger, the angel, coming and providing provisions for Elijah in the wilderness. What does that remind you of?
So I think this story has more parallels with Hagar.
Good.
Being cast out. For one thing, we're near Beersheba, Abraham lived.
Good.
We know that Hagar is sent away, very little to eat or drink.
Yep.
And she also ends up, she puts Ishmael under a bush to presumably to die, and then she goes and a short ways away, and then she cries, and it's kind of similar to this. I mean, there's a lot of parallels.
Yeah.
She's been sent away. She has nowhere to go, and she's under the bush, and an angel shows up. So I think it may be even I can't remember what the right word for it. It's like the format of the story is such that you are expecting, okay, if you read in the Bible that somebody goes off in the desert alone and they sit under a bush, then God or an angel is going to come to them and make sure that they have something to eat or drink and give them some kind of a message.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that's for me, that's what this sounds like here.
Good. Yeah, that's absolutely. If you're curious to go look that up at any point, that's in the Genesis chapter 21 is where that incident happens. Hagar and her son Ishmael get sent out. And yes, it's actually very, very similar to this. They sit down under a tree and are fed. And I think that's, the reason I think it's worth it to note all of these connections is because I think the story is deliberately trying to situate Elijah within that web of connection, of meaning, as in a way, both I think kind of authenticating the story and also adding sort of context for interpretation, for meaning making of it. What is the point of this broom bush incident? It's both to tell within just the sort of in a vacuum, to tell the story of Elijah being sustained by God, but also for you to have that connection, that echo in the back of your mind to Hagar and Ishmael, being sent away from Abraham. And it sort of gives this like a story, like like another dimension to it. Like this happens not just, in a vacuum in this one story, but this happens in the context of God's provision for outcasts all through history, right? And in the context of the prophets, sort of inner turmoil, which is echoed through Jonah, right? It gives the whole thing this sense of like bigness, right? Awesome. It's a little bit like the connection to Hagar is very clear and direct. I think there's probably also an echo of the manna in the wilderness the Israelites were provided with, just in terms of thinking about times people were sustained in the wilderness. That's another one too, especially as we think about where he heads. We can double back to the map real quick. So he went down to Jezreel, all the way down south across the border past Jerusalem to Beersheba here, which is at the sort of northern end of the Negev. And he heads towards what the text calls Horeb. Now, Horeb in the books that are connected to Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy calls Mount Sinai Horeb. It sort of has more than one name. So basically, anytime you see Horeb, it's AKA Mount Sinai. So we have him sustained in the wilderness here, and then going 40 days and 40 nights. Hopefully that has some significance for you too, to the mountain of God at Horeb, which is also Sinai. Okay. What does 40 days and 40 nights remind you of? I got at least a couple of things here.
Yeah.
Well, Moses up on Mount Sinai.
Good. That's clear. That's a clear one, especially at Mount Sinai. Yeah, Moses is up there, and there's a couple. It's mentioned a couple of times, but yeah, Moses spent 40 days and 40 nights on the mountain. In fact, without food, which is also here he had one meal that lasted him a month. It seems. Good. Anything else?
Well, Noah.
Noah, good. Yep. Noah in the ark for 40 days and 40 nights. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there are more. 40 is what they call in biblical studies, they call it a typological number, which means it's kind of it's formulaic. It's not supposed to be taken literally. It kind of just means a long time. But it's, consistent through the Noah story, the Moses on Sinai story, and Elijah here, as well as other places, encouraging you to kind of make that connection. Good. So we have Elijah connected now to Hagar. We have Elijah connected to Jonah, and connected to Moses as well. And actually, in fact, returning almost in a sort of pantomime of the Moses role, returning to Sinai, going into a cave and spending the night. And I think that's really the one that's going to get played out. I think we're on Stephanie. Is your turn to read again? When you're ready. And off of mute. Go ahead.
Okay. Then the word of the Lord came to him. God said to him, "Why are you here, Elijah?" He replied, "I am moved by zeal for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to the sword. I alone am left, and they are out to take my life." "Come out," God called, "and stand on the mountain before the Lord." And lo, the Lord passed by. There was a great and mighty wind, splitting mountains and shattering rocks by the power of the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a soft murmuring sound. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his mantle about his face and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then a voice addressed him, "Why are you here, Elijah?" He answered, I am moved by zeal for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and have put your prophets to the sword. I alone am left, and they are out to take my life.
Good, thank you. So it occurred to me, since this is a big chunk, to split this up, but I decided to leave it intact because I think it just cries out to be read as a whole. But there's a lot going on here for us to unpack. So let's start at the beginning. The word of the Lord came to God, and God said to him, "Why are you here, Elijah?" What do you make of that question? Why are you here? Is it possible God doesn't know? No.
No,
Clearly no.
We know. God,
I think,
God. Of course, God
I
does,
think
right?
God knows why he's there. I think he realizes that Elijah's in a real spiritual crisis, and he's he doesn't know why he's here anymore.
Right.
And
It's a
wants him to
rhetorical
reflect
question.
on this. He's posing a question he wants him to reflect on.
Yeah, it's a question not for God, but for Elijah. It's a rhetorical question for him to understand. Can you think of another time God asks a human a rhetorical question?
Well, Adam in the
Good.
garden.
Yeah. Good, Rachel. Yeah, God calls out to Adam and says, "Ayika," right? Where are you? As if God doesn't know. There's only like 2 people on earth. You think God lost track of them? Right?
Not
So
like
that's one of the ways we understand that story is that it's a rhetorical question for Adam. Where are you in relation to me? Or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So maybe similar here. Why are you here, Elijah? Like sort of why are you here in relation to me? Not, you could have run anywhere, right? You could have gone north to Lebanon or east.
or
right?
even why
All
are
the way
you
south.
here? Even
Mhm.
why are you here on earth alive? Like
Sure.
why
Yeah.
what is your reason for being here?
Mm-hmm. And again, in our little running checklist of biblical connections, we have a connection between Elijah all the way back to the beginning of Genesis, right, into to Adam, where I think we're very much supposed to hear all these kind of reminders throughout all this. What do you make of Elijah's answer? I'm moved by zeal. The Israelites have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, put your prophets to the sword. I'm the only one left, and they're coming to kill me.
Well, maybe he's interpreting it as, why are you here hiding in this cave?
Good. It seems like he sort of takes the question at face value, right? Like not, yeah, I'm on the run. Did you not read everything in the last couple of chapters? Like, why do you think I'm here?
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm here because of you, because of my zeal for you.
Right. Yeah. I think it could be something along those lines. He clearly, I mean, I guess that when I encounter this first response, and he repeats it again, word for word, again later. But when I counter this first one, it sort of seems like, oh man, this guy really doesn't get it. Like God's not asking why you're here, like how did you get here, what road you took, or what happened in the last story. God's asking something bigger, and you're not there yet at all, right? You're still focused in the moments and what your problems are, right? And on your own sense of failure or desperation or whatever it is.
It seems like maybe Elijah, having performed all of what he had done and then run, is now kind of doubting himself.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, he's saying that I'm moved by zeal for you, but he's also feeling a little shook up about what's all happened.
Yeah. I think we've noted Elijah's clearly having some kind of crisis of faith or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which seems to be sort of manifest in his ultra focus in the here and now, right? And exactly what's happening to him and what the what the current circumstances are. We then get this sequence that again has a parallel in a biblical story. It parallels that this is in Exodus 33 if you want to go look it up. That moment where Moses wants to witness God's presence. And so God has him stand in the cleft of the rock where God shelters him and passes by, right? We get this moment here where God, Elijah's in the cave, he's somehow sheltered. But God is also like, come out. Although God says, come out, and then the presence happens, and then Elijah comes out and stands at the entrance somehow. And yes, this is one of the more famous, sort of passages. There's a first wind, which split the mountains and shattered the rocks by the power of the Lord. But God was not in the wind. After wind, earthquake, and God was not in the earthquake. Fire, but God is not in the fire. After the fire, it translates here, this is the New JPS translation, a soft murmuring sound. What do you think that means? So others translate this line. The Hebrew is kol dmama daka. Others translate a still small voice. If we were to take the Hebrew over literally, it would be something like the voice of thin stillness. What do you think that means? The Hebrew is totally opaque. So how do you understand that? How do you understand the soft murmuring, still small voice?
Well, you have to listen harder to hear something small and quiet.
Good. Okay. What is the small, quiet thing that Elijah needs to hear?
Lord.
God. Okay. I don't want to intrude my thoughts too quick yet. I want to hear more from you folks. I'm going to stay quiet until you tell me what you think about the still small voice.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if God's trying to teach him a lesson, that there's this still small voice someplace, it must be in contrast to what God sees in Elijah, and counter to this, what Elijah refers to as a zeal, okay? Because the thing that Elijah staged in front of was this major production,
right? Yeah.
And there was a lot there. I mean, there was this huge fire. There was the slaughtering of the grabbing of the priests and the slaughtering of them.
Yeah.
And obviously at this point, maybe, and if Elijah felt that he had convinced the Israelites who at least were present at that, they should, get rid of Baal and wiped out all their priests. It's like, and possibly, maybe even convince Achav of his wrongdoing, then everything should be okay. But still, his life is in danger, right? Jezebel's after him. So obviously, what he did didn't work. It's like his mission was to, point out their wrongs and make things right. And yet here he's come, and when he talks about what's happened, he doesn't talk about the success at Carmel. He talks about the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, tore down your altars, they put your prophets to the sword. All he can think about is his condition at the moment which that he's left, and he's probably not going to live long.
Good.
They're going to get him.
Good. Yeah. That he's, and despite, accomplishing my sensible mission of like pointing out to them how wrong they are, I can't sort of go do it for him. I can't bring back those priests that they've slaughtered, right? I can't do the tshuva for them. I can only, I've done the thing you want me to do, and it doesn't seem like it's really solved anything. Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Good. Yeah. And I think this is definitely part of my interpretation. The parallel in between the grand spectacle of the wind and the earthquake and the fire, and the parallel between that and what we said about how Elijah and Achav and the people and everyone understand God, that like God is somehow about spectacle, and it's got to be big, and it's got to be dramatic. It's got to be, the biggest possible come from behind victory where, the wet altar is ignited. Only that is what demonstrates God's power. And here God's not in any of those things, whatever that even means, that God was not in the wind. But somehow God's in, I think we're supposed to read God as being in the voice of thin stillness. Something subtle, something that you have to strain to hear, especially, after fire and earthquake and all this, like you probably have ringing in your ears still. And, what's left after that is like the subtlest whisper.
It reminds me of, I forget which psalm it is we read, but it says not in horses and not in the, strength of man does God delight.
Right.
So God isn't interested in these big showboating demonstrations of power.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, maybe you can persuade people to follow me by, doing this big grand production, but it's probably not going to really stick.
Mm-hmm. How do you think this display with the wind and the earthquake and the fire and then the still small voice, how does it respond to Elijah's complaint? Like, why is this God's answer? How does this address what Elijah just said?
Well, maybe he's telling him that you have to look within for God, and that's kind of what he needs to go and transmit to people, that God is within each of us and not not big grand.
Yes. Okay, good. And how does that address what Elijah just said? His complaints are, the Israelites have forsaken you, and they've torn down the altars and put your prophets to the sword, and I'm alone here.
Maybe God is saying you're looking at the wrong thing. It's not about the powers. It's not about power, like the power to kill and the power to, force things, tearing down altars and taking lives of priests, and then taking, revenge on the person who killed the priest. It's not about that. That's not what that's not the true source of what I want. And that's ultimately not going to hold or stand.
Good. Yeah, I think that's in a lot of ways almost the distilled essence of the prophetic message, right? Like, it's not about sacrifices. Like, I don't really care about altars, right? Yes, the prophets are human life, but I don't really care about priesthood as sort of an apparatus to serve me, right? That's not actually what matters. That's all part of the display. That's all parallel to the mountains and the earthquake, or the fire and the wind and the earthquake, right? What I care about is what's inside, and as long as there are Israelites, then there is then that still small voice is around, because they all have within them that little bit of that murmuring sound, that sort of hint of the divine voice, that that sort of fleeting sense of divinity and divine presence. Also, if that's the case, you're really not alone at all. Despite being the only one left, as long as you're alive, or as long as anyone is alive, God's there too, right? You're really not alone, and you're, the fact that they're out to get you is beside the point. Good. Okay. I think there may also, be sort of and I guess in that, you're pointing out that, your life is your life, and yes, it matters to you, but is in the grand scheme of things, you're one person. Reassuring, you're really not alone, but also kind of restoring a sense of proportion to this whole thing. It's actually not all on your shoulders, right? Mm. All these other people are still around. Even though there are no prophets, you may understand yourself to be the only prophet left. It's really not all about you, right? What do you make of it then? So after this display, God asks again, right? God asks, why are you here? Have you figured it out yet? And what does Elijah do? He repeats his answer word for word. Why do you think so?
So he hasn't figured it out yet. He hasn't gotten the message.
Okay, so Stephanie says he hasn't figured it out. Okay, I think that's totally defensible. He's like, I didn't get any of that. None of that made any sense to me. I'm going to answer at face value again. Very possible. Do the words feel any different to you somehow? I think, imagine this story, we're reading this from a screen, right? Or, a digitization of a book where whatever sort of emotion or, expression the words get comes from us, Imagine this was presented in the form it probably was originally transmitted as an oral story. Imagine someone was telling this around the fire. Do you think maybe the point here is for the storyteller to say those same words but with a different inflection?
Yeah, because hopefully the listeners have got the message. And so that when they ask, when it's said again, then the listener has a new perspective on what's being said.
Yeah, I really like that. I really like this interpretation I'm proposing, that we're supposed to read those same words as if Elijah is saying them, but they have a new meaning to him. Because I think that gets across what I understand to be kind of the bigger points, is that it's your framing, it's your perception that needs a readjustment here. You've misunderstood the big picture, and God's saying, your complaints, or Elijah, what God's saying, what Elijah's understanding is that your problems are still your problems. This new understanding is not changing the fact that, yes, they are very much out to kill you, and they have very much destroyed the altars and slaughtered prophets. Those are still problems that need to be dealt with. What we're turning here is your understanding of the whole situation, your understanding of the big picture. So why are you here? It's in some ways the same, but I can hear Elijah reading it or saying these words with a kind of renewed confidence, a renewed sense of purpose, a sense of, instead of complaint as a statement of, something like mission. I really like that. I really like that interpretation because I don't know, somehow Elijah didn't get it. This display, this display of yeah, I don't know. That's just not nearly as fun for me. I'm motivated to try to read it positively for Elijah here.
Mhm.
Yeah,
There-
Richard, go ahead.
There's something else that I noticed that's different between these two reports
Okay.
of what happened. In the first one, and of course I don't have the text in front of me, and
Mhm.
maybe you do, and you can.
I can, yeah.
So in the first one, it says, God said to him, "Why are you here, Elijah?"
Hmm.
Second time, it's, then a voice addressed him, "Why are you here, Elijah?"
Hmm.
Curious to know,
Okay, let's see.
the word for voice, is it also?
It is. Good noticing, Richard. So in the Hebrew of verse 9 there, it says, oh, I'm sorry, verse 9 says V'hine devar Hashem elav. So the word of the Lord came to him, Vayomer lo, and it said to him, Malacha po Eliyahu, like, why are you here? What's for you here?
Mhm.
And then Elijah answers. And in the second telling, it says V'hine elav kol. Literally a voice came to him.
Right.
Vayomer malacha
Same
po.
word as in kol demama daka. Right?
Yeah, I wonder if that's something missed by the translation. We're supposed to read the word "kol" again. This time,
Mhm.
what's coming to him is that understanding of the voice within, right? That
Mhm.
so even though the words are the same, Elijah hears the question from a different place,
Right.
Mhm.
It's
right?
the
Instead of this
self-reflection.
external, right? Yeah, awesome.
As long as we're looking at the words a little more closely, I notice in verse 10 in the English it says he replied, and in 14 it says he answered. Now I would have thought that the word
Humor.
exactly the same.
Yeah, it is. I don't know why they made that choice there.
Okay, never mind then.
Yeah, in both cases, it says Vayomer Kano King.
Uh,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I really like that too. That he understands the question instead of coming from something bigger that dwarfs his significance. He understands the question is coming from within.
Hmm.
It's almost like he's asking himself, or something like that, or the divinity within him is asking, "Why are you here?"
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
And given that, I can well imagine, the storyteller saying that second reply in a different manner,
Right.
a quieter one. The first one is, I'm here. I'm filled with zeal, and this.
Nice.
The second one, it's like, kind of saying it to himself almost, like, this is where I am, and
Good.
alone, and
Good.
yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, this passage is so good. There's so much to unpack here. We should keep moving because we got to finish up at some point today. But I got to tell you, it's a bit of a, considering how rich these verses are, the other ones go by relatively quickly. I think we're on Rachel to read. Rachel, do you mind reading? There's two sections that'll compose the epilogue. What happens to Elijah after this?
Sure.
Okay, go ahead.
The Lord said to him, "Go back by the way you came and on to the wilderness of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael as king of Aram. Also anoint Jehu son of Nimshi as king of Israel, and anoint Elisha son of Shaphat of Abel Meholah to succeed you as prophet." Wow, he's going to be busy. Whoever
Yeah, right?
escapes the sword of Hazael shall be slain by Jehu, and whoever escapes the sword of Jehu shall be slain by Elisha. I will leave in Israel only 7,000, every knee that has not knelt to Baal and every mouth that has not kissed him.
Okay.
Well, wait a minute. That just kind of like we just did another U-turn.
Yeah. Okay. So what do you
I
make?
thought it wasn't about power and killing. I thought it was about the still small voice.
Good. So maybe, yeah, yes. And at the same time, like I said, the problems are still real problems.
Hmm.
It's the framing that's changed somehow, because you're right. This comes across as like, wow, this is really a straightforward, like, kind of we're going to solve this problem with more killing approach, almost,
Now,
right?
the wilderness of Damascus, is that even part of ancient Israel?
It's not, and that is actually very interesting here too. So God says you're going to go anoint 3 people, and 2 of them are weird because we know about kings of Israel being anointed as in with oil. So anointing Yehu, son of Nimshi, as king of Israel makes sense. He's saying go replace Achav, right? Go replace the king who clearly has not got it. That one makes sense. But Hazael, king of Aram, we have an Israelite prophet being directed to go anoint a foreign king. That's strange. And yes, I think wilderness of Damascus indicate, Aram is east of the land of Israel. Evidently the author of Kings understands God as, like a lot of these prophetic books, understanding God as utilizing other nations to punish Israel when needed. So it seems like the meaning is like, make Hazael the king, and he'll go and attack Israel and bring it to its senses, something like that. Yehu, we talked about, that kind of makes sense. But Elisha too, anoint son Elisha to succeed you as prophet, is also a bit peculiar because one, we don't actually hear about prophets ever being anointed. That's not part of how you become a prophet usually, at least not in any official capacity. And moreover, we don't usually get prophets appointing their own successor within their lifetime, with one notable exception. Who can think of it? It's actually in Parashat Pinchat.
Oh, Moshe anoints Joshua.
Yeah, Moses gets to appoint Joshua, right? So there's this way, I think part of this is, this web of connection building up Elijah as kind of a second Moses in some ways, returning to Sinai, all this kind of stuff, and appointing a successor, which is the only other person ever get to do that is Moses. So God seems to respond to Elijah with, like very this worldly kind of stuff. Doesn't say like, oh, now you understand, something deeper about yourself. Namaste, right? Like that's not it at all. There's a commentator called Malbim who suggests that this responds, or corresponds to Elijah's complaint. Basically, that each one to be anointed is going to respond to a different part of the complaints. Hazael is going to punish the people who tore down the altars. Yehu is going to punish the people who killed the prophets, and Elisha would be the prophet with and after him. So addressing the fact that, I'm alone and they're off to kill me, which makes a certain amount of sense. God saying, yeah, you got the bigger point. We've successfully reframed your perception of all this, and we still need to address those very real problems. Okay. Let's read the epilogue and then we'll talk about the whole thing. We're back to Richard.
Oh, I'm still reading?
Oh no, we're back to Richard, sorry.
Sorry.
He set out from there and came upon Elisha, son of Shaphat, as he was plowing. There were 12 yoke of oxen ahead of him, and he was with the 12th. Elijah came over to him and threw his mantle over him. He left the oxen and ran after Elijah, saying, "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye, and I will follow you." And he answered him, "Go back. What have I done to you?" He turned back from him and took the yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. He boiled their meat with the gear of the oxen and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he arose and followed Elijah and became his attendant.
And that's the end of the story. It's sort of like, I don't know, this feels like a very different, very different material than the what happened at Horeb there. But basically this 3-verse epilogue concludes both this story of Elijah and our Haftarah, and the Book of Kings moves on to other concerns, other king history stuff. Elijah goes, he got 3 tasks. There's 3 anointings he's supposed to do. He does them apparently out of order. The text doesn't mention completing the other 2, the anointing of the 2 kings. He just the text has him going and anointing Elisha. And in fact, there's no anointing at all, at least not in the sense of anointing with oil. He tosses his cloak on him. And it seems like he sort of tosses his cloak and starts walking away because Elisha runs after him. What do you think of that? What is that sort of, the fact that that's how Elijah approaches this? What does that tell you about, or how does your impression of Elijah change, or the sense that does this back up our reading that Elijah got it? He somehow got the message, or is this undermining that? What do you think of this whole toss the cloak and run thing?
It's almost like he's resenting that someone's going to replace him.
Could be.
But I don't know what to make of it. The whole passage is very strange.
Yeah, I would say exactly that, Rachel. This part is very, very weird compared to the rest. And I think it's pretty likely that we're dealing with some editorial history. Maybe there was something else in here that got snipped out, or something else that followed that would have made this more sense. It might make more sense, but we have what we have.
Yeah, and like when Elisha answered, what's his name?
Elijah and Elisha.
Elisha. Okay. When Elijah answered Elisha, he was saying, "Go back. What have I done to you?"
Yeah.
It seems like he's having second thoughts about having done that.
Maybe I can see that. The Hebrew is me asitili. It's literally like, what have I done to you, or what have I done for you?
Is that a way of saying, yeah, go back? I mean, why are you asking me? Is it a
potentially? Yeah. So I think one interpretation that makes sense here is, Elijah comes and throws his cloak on Elisha, which is in a certain kind of anointing. It's a cloak has kind of some symbolic power. It's like
the mantle,
as if we were to take a crown and put it on a new king's head, right? Elisha kind of gets it. He evidently knows who Elijah is without any words being exchanged, and knows what he's now being asked to do. And so he leaves the oxen and runs after, saying, let me say goodbye and I'll follow you. Elijah's like, go back. What have I done to you? And meaning something like, I won't stand in your way. Maybe say, go right ahead. But that's actually not what Elisha does. So it seems like it's either sarcastic or somehow coding something else. So maybe saying something like, I'm not stopping you. It's a reasonable request, but if you do that, it's going to the symbolic act that I've done is going to lose its significance, right? It's not just this moment of sweeping you up and making you a prophet and your life is changing. You're gonna double back and try to say goodbye. Like you're done. You're a prophet now. You need to leave all that behind. That's one of my best guesses, I would say. Because he doesn't go back. Elisha seems to understand that, doesn't go back, and in fact just goes ahead and, I think perhaps also symbolically slaughter the oxen that were previously his charge, of basically abandoning that, his life prior to that moment. I think we're supposed to understand he uses the wooden plow and stuff like that to make a fire. It's not that he was like cooking them, cooking the stuff like the leather and the stuff with the meat. I think he uses that to make the fire and just kind of gives it away. And then goes on with his new life. We're probably also supposed to read into that, 12 is a typological number as well. Anytime you read 12, I think you're supposed to think of the 12 tribes.
And he was with the 12th. I mean, it does seem important because they're calling our attention to it.
Right. It's unclear which would be the 12th.
Right.
Benjamin probably, because he was the 12th born son. Although I would have to look up if we know which tribe, if Elisha is in fact a Benjaminite or what. but he, we heard in the previous passage, everyone who escapes Hazael will be slain by Yehu, and escapes the start of Yehu will be slain by Elisha. Maybe there's a symbolic slaughtering of the 12 oxen is like a, sort of purging Israel of, all the idolaters, something like that. Yeah, this part's hard. This part's hard, and it ends so abruptly here that it feels frustrating in a way that the rest does not. So I'm going to suggest that we go and kind of look at the story as a whole and ask some of our kind of big evaluative meaning-making questions. More focusing on the on this part, this part, the fire and earthquake go in and the soft murmuring sound. So, how do you think this text maybe spoke to people at the time when it was written? And I think you can think of, what would the original Elijah story have meant to people? Maybe also what would the Book of Kings, if you were an exile reading this in the Book of Kings, what would this story have meant to you? Or how would it have spoken to you?
It would have been a warning that in exile they were not to deviate from the worship of God, and worship
Certainly
the gods of Babylon.
Sure. Yeah, in the context of the whole Book of Kings, that's what they would have heard is you're here because your ancestors screwed up. You all need to avoid that same mistake, definitely. Maybe on a more sort of emotional level, why would this been there's a lot of texts that basically tell that same message of don't worship other gods, right? Why is this a story worth telling in particular?
What the message of the small, quiet voice, that your life and relationship to God is within.
Mm-hmm. Keep going. Why would that be important for exiles to hear?
Because they've lost the temple and they've lost their basic, the worship life that they had known, and they need to have something different.
Okay. If you're under the impression that, like Elisha and Achav and the people at the beginning of the story, you're under the impression that God is in the big, mighty, powerful acts, and here you just were on the butt end of a mighty, powerful act, right? That is, an invading army and the destruction of a whole country, right?
Mm-hmm.
What might you think about God? In your relationship to God, that God has turned against you. Right?
Yeah.
Something like that, right? If you're, if that's all you understand about God, that God acts, with these mighty powers in the world, you may be really missing something crucial, which is that, the voice within is what matters. And actually, you brought God with you into exile in that way, right? That the altar and the temple, that's actually not what matters. I would say maybe there's one other, so I think that's one way it may have been important for them to hear the story. I had one other thought, which is that, Elijah is a hero to a certain kind of Israelites with a particular approach to religion, the sort of crusading zealot approach, right? But also one of, a courageous and brave approach, in the face of, real persecution and death threats. I could see this have been important for communities in exile to hear too, to say, here's your hero, here's the guy to emulate, to be brave, and to act despite threats to you, and sort of a message of courage, or here was a guy who used to fight, who kept fighting even when the odds were long, something along those lines. Yeah. why do you think this text got picked as a Haftarah? So we touched on a couple of connections to Pinchas, and we could do, I'm sure, a whole other shiur where we read Parashat Pinchas in depth and, match them up. But, I think concentrating on, the fact that somebody picked this, communities picked this to be read aloud meant that it must have spoken to them as a worthwhile story to tell. How do you think this text spoke to Jewish communities in between then and now?
I mean, the obvious connection is that you have two people that are zealous for the God of Israel
Mm-hmm.
and go to great lengths to make sure that the people don't stray. And I
Sure.
can see a people that's in exile surrounded by alien gods that seem to be more powerful than the God that let them be taken into exile and defeated, would be tempted to follow after those gods.
Sure.
And at the time of the diaspora, then people were at that point surrounded by Christians and being martyred and
Eventually, yeah. Mm-hmm.
and so it was reminder that within you, when you're within your community, God is still there.
Yeah. I think, yeah, same kind of thing. Definitely. I actually think, do you think this text is pro-zealotry or anti-zealotry?
Anti-zealotry.
Okay.
Definitely.
Why do you say that, Richard?
And I definitely would see this Haftarah as a counterbalance.
Okay. Say more about that.
To Pinchas.
Yeah.
Where in Pinchas, you have God rewarding him for his zealotry.
Right.
And here in the Haftarah, we see a story where it's, I believe, saying, the zealotry, it's not so hot if it's going to lead you to violence.
Sure.
It would be better for you to be, listen to that still small voice within you and acting in ways that are in line with that, rather than in taking violent action as a way of demonstrating your, love of God.
Good. Yeah, I agree. I see this too. Pinchas, it comes across as pretty much a ringing endorsement of zealotry and religious murder. Whereas this is really not so. This is at least equivocal, right? Elijah still gets to keep being a prophet. It's not like he's punished or anything. God seems to overall approve of that, but it's not just like, great job, Elijah, keep it up. It's like, you really need to make sure you understand what it is you're doing, make sure you're framing this properly. I feel like that may have been actually an important message in, for communities over the last 2,000 years, where, acts of, sort of ostentatious zealotry would have been a terrible idea. That would have just provoked the wrath of whatever Christian or Muslim authorities would have been in charge. Generally speaking, Judaism is anti-zealotry. Being a zealot doesn't really do anyone any good. It'll get you killed, and it'll probably get a bunch of other people killed. So I think that, there may be a reason this is preserved there to reflect that sentiment of just sort of not letting Parashat Pinchas have the only word on this issue. Yeah. And we touched on it a little bit, but how does this text speak to us now? This is a personal question. How does this text speak to you now as a 21st century reader?
I think I still appreciate that sentiment against zealotry. I mean, there's some of the ultra-Orthodox in Israel are sometimes drawn to violence against other people who are not
not immune to that.
In law the same as them, and it's not a pleasant thing to witness.
Good.
Seems to be totally lost on them that what they're doing is actually wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? I think we sort of talked a little bit about this along the way of how we understand, especially this passage, the
Mhm.
still small voice.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think the anti-zealotry message is still relevant.
Yeah.
I've heard this taught. What's his name? Zelig, the wilderness Torah guy, came to Hebrew college and taught this one time. I think there's a way that this is really kind of outdoors Torah. Torah for the wilderness, Torah to like take on a camping trip with you and discuss as you are kind of immersed in the wilderness and the, in some way the power around you and in whatever sort of natural phenomenon you're experiencing when you're outdoors, remembering that it's the spark within all of that, right? We've sort of used we use this sort of spark or light metaphor a lot here. It uses a sound metaphor, of a murmur of a voice inside all of that, all of the wonders of nature, which is where God is really located within all of that. Good. Any other final comments or thoughts? Thanks for learning with me.